Next presentation is Richard Staines from Kinesiology. His presentation is Neuroimaging for Understanding Motor Recovery Following Stroke. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm in the Department of Kinesiology, as it says there, and my interest, background is really as a neurophysiologist and as somebody who's interested in how the brain and the central nervous system controls human movement. I just got here for the last talk, so this is going to seem much more macro than that beautiful talk we just heard on the embryo imaging. We use techniques, neuroimaging techniques, and I'm going to talk about one of them in particular today. But one theme of my lab is to try to understand how the brain or cortical system, neural systems in the brain adapt to behavior, to learning new behaviors, after there's been injury to the system, which is a particular connection to stroke here. And then most importantly, how those two things interact. So how can we understand, based on the neuroanatomical location of damage in the brain and the neurophysiological state of the system, how can we use that information to either categorize people into certain streams for rehabilitation or to inform new neurorehabilitation techniques. One of the techniques we use in the lab is something called functional MRI. Probably everybody's familiar with MRI. It's a very good way in which you can get three-dimensional pictures of the brain and other tissues in the body. What we use is a slight adaptation of that that allows us to measure functional activity of the behaving human when they're in there. There's a couple of, you'll hear a little bit more about this afternoon from James and Myra who are in the audience. What this technique allows you to do is it's really based on the principle that neural activity is coupled to the delivery of oxygenated blood flow through the vasculature. And there's a pretty tight coupling there. When neurons become more active in a particular region of the brain, when I ask you or somebody asks you to do a certain task, those neurons dump more neurotransmitter across the synaptic clefts. There's binding to receptors. There's an alteration in the ionic flow across membranes. And all of that has a metabolic demand. It requires energy to run the sodium-potassium pump, to take up the neurotransmitters that are released there. And the cardiovascular system adapts to that or compensates for that by supplying more oxygenated blood to that region of the brain or that very specific local area that requires that information. Functional MRI works in the sense that deoxygenated hemoglobin, after the oxygen has been taken off in the capillary bed here, deoxygenated hemoglobin has a small magnetic property to it. It makes the hydrogen, the protons, dephase more quickly. When the brain's active and there's more oxygenated blood that gets sent there, it kind of overcompensates for the amount of oxygen that's required. And there's a relative decrease in the amount of deoxygenated hemoglobin. It makes the MR signal or the functional activity go up. This is something that's called the blood oxygen level dependent response or contrast. It's described in 1990 by Ogawa and his colleagues. So you'll often see these bold contrast maps. So what we do is we study individuals, put them in the magnet, and we have them do certain tasks. So I'll just give you an example of one type of thing we might do here. One thing we really try to do is to quantify and control the behavior of the individual when they're in the magnet. So this is an example. I'm going to show you a couple of images where they're doing really simple things. We put them in the magnet. We give them these two little tubes that have a force-sensing resistor on there so we can quantify the timing and the relative amplitude of the behavior. And we're going to have a stroke patient do three things. Grip with their left hand in one scan, grip with their right hand in another scan, and grip simultaneously with both hands in a third scan. This is a structural MRI image with a statistical map overlaid onto it. The colors here are the statistical map that's laid on top of the structural image of the brain. This would be as if you were to cut your brain open right about this level above your ears and look from your feet up. This individual is 9 days post-stroke. He had a hemorrhagic stroke in the right hemisphere of the brain. You can see that little area, a pool of blood in this region. I'm just going to focus on these last two. When we asked him to grip with his right hand, this little spot in the brain, this is something called the central sulcus, and the primary motor cortex is right in front of that. That's a part of the brain that's responsible for executing movement. And he had a lack of activity in that region when we asked him to use his affected hand. When he did tasks where he gripped with both hands, now we see a facilitation of that activity. These red dots are indications that the bold response increased when he did that task. After he recovered for 28 days later, he had fairly minor deficits, and they largely went away. This inhibition or inactivity that we see here in the right motor cortex is gone, and now we don't see a facilitation anymore with the bilateral movement. The beauty of the technique for what we want to do is that you can measure in individuals, when they're performing one specific task, how the brain is activating. And then I'm going to skip towards the end here because we're going to run out of time, but what we try to use that for is, can we take advantage of that effect, that we see a neuroimaging marker for facilitation of activity? Could we design quite simple physical therapy kind of techniques to take advantage of that increase and adapt the neural map that's in that region? So we have tasks where we have these same things in the scanner, and they're tracing or tracking the targets that are presented on the screen by squeezing against those tubes and moving a cursor. Another thing we might do is have them trace a square or a circle that's on there. It requires sequential activity between the two limbs. Or where they might trace a shape that's more coordinated movements required. So if you're trying to trace a circle on the screen, you have to continuously modulate the activity of the two limbs. And I'm going to skip those and just finish here that this is just a summary of various techniques you can use for neuroimaging. I just talked about fMRI is a correlation technique where you are correlating activity of the brain with the function you do. There's other techniques like magnetic stimulation where you try to disrupt the activity of the brain. It's also really an imaging type of technique. I better stop there so I don't get us off time. Thanks very much.
So questions or comments?
Do you have any issues with co-registration, Rich, from taking images from the 9 days to 28 days post?
In those scans I showed there, the co-registration is done to the structural scan you do in the same session. So those aren't really, and then those particular ones, the region of interest you look at are within that same session scan. There could be some potential problems if you were to take, especially somebody with a cortical injury, that the structure of the surface of the brain is changing, and try to co-register it to one scan over time. That could be slightly problematic. But we always redo the structural scan at the same time.
Richard?
Yeah, when I did my presentation this morning, I outlined how we're hoping to get to Grand River. But I'd like if you and Myra and James could each sort of explain what you have to do now to do your research.
Oh, yes. I whipped past that. I was meant to talk about that, but I currently go to Sunnybrook Hospital to do the scans. I'm connected with the stroke recovery group funded through the Heart and Stroke Foundation. So we do all of the functional imaging at Sunnybrook Hospital, bring the data back to Waterloo for the scanning. And as Rich mentioned, hopefully over the next year or so we'll be able to initiate some functional MRI capabilities at Grand River that would make that much nicer.
We've also begun a collaboration with Vladimir Hitchinsky at University of Western Ontario that I know you missed that one, but you were away or something like that. But that is another huge opportunity. We're hoping to get that started the next week. So that's yet another
Fantastic,
thing, a little bit closer than Sunnybrook.
Quick comment. That's a common theme of many of us working in biomedical imaging. I work with UBC in Toronto.
Yeah.
Nothing here. So how is it being fixed?
There are components on this last slide that we do have here. We do the EEG, electrical activity mapping here, and we do the magnetic stimulation work here. But the structural and functional MRI is all done elsewhere.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks.